And all these like bells and whistles and shit just to remind me to like breathe or whatever on my phone. It's not to remind me to breathe. It's to remind me to like lock the cars. So much shit. It's like, and then the important things I like totally whiff on, and I'm like, oh, whoops, but the car's locked. I did it at 8:15 last night. Oh,
Maybe instead of having a car lock alarm, you should just have a breathe alarm. But you wouldn't be able to listen to it, right? It would go off and you would close your eyes and start to draw in the splendor. And then one of your fucking kids would be like, God, Dad, I'm going to hit you with a sword.
yeah, that's probably. It's either that or I'd have already passed out already from not breathing. So how could I hear the alarm? You know the beds down here? Yeah, go ahead. Luis is just like crawling underneath them like Snoopy in that one holiday special, Peanuts, whatever. Remember when he's like ducking down underneath the grass and like his legs are low and his like belly's on the ground. He's got the like the military helmet on. Anyway, that's what she's doing underneath those beds. It is hilarious.
Well, Louisa, is that your wife? Who's Louisa?
Shit, that's right. Who's
The listeners don't know what the fuck you're talking about.
Lisa's my dog.
Aha.
I'm like, just, my turtle.
If you need to relax, you should be visiting pristine, frozen northern Minnesota tonight. The moon is new and every star in the universe is out and you can see the Milky Way and it's just freezing cold and beautiful.
Somewhere, wherever Richard Dawkins is, he's getting a hard on right now.
Are you listening, Richard? The stars are out in the sky.
Yeah. Are you listening, Dick? Not you, Dick. The other Dick. Explicit. So, I can do this whole thing. I'm Ryan. I'm sorry, I don't have anything tonight for you, Harland.
And I'm Harland. And this is the Dawdlers Philosophy Podcast. About Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Good old tender vittles. I did prepare that one.
I think what is that? I don't even get it.
You didn't know tender vittles that look like it was like a cat food?
I don't do cats. What the hell are you talking about now?
Tender vittles was like a cat food. Anyway, Wittgenstein. Good old tender vittles. I prepared it.
Everybody's exhausted.
Apparently. We're tired. We're having a nice Eeyore night with Vitty. My cousin Vitty. Yeah, we're going to talk about Wittgenstein. But not just like Wittgenstein, the life at times, right? I mean, this is not that. This is something super specific. You are not just... Because if you were to try and do something like that, you'd need more than the amount of time that we've allotted for ourselves tonight, right?
We have no station master. We can go as long as we want, till Ryan literally falls asleep on air. But no, we're not going to go... I mean, I can run through a few details, just so it's on the record, about his life, in case some of our 8.1 listeners are interested.
Oh, God.
But
keeps going up.
primarily, we're going to talk about one of his posthumously published notebooks entitled On Certainty. But yeah, Wittgenstein, I'm probably going to be saying this in multiple pronunciations tonight, so deal. Only published one thing while he was alive, the young Wittgenstein version of the Tractatus, Logico-Philosophicus, when he was hanging out with Moore and Russell at Cambridge and fighting in the trenches.
Yeah.
But almost everything of Wittgenstein's that we have nowadays was published after he was gone. He born in 1889, died in 1951, I think, of prostate cancer. And the big whoop works that we have from him, Philosophical Investigations, the Blue and Brown books on certainty, and others, all of this was just collections of notebooks published posthumously. He was, you may be glad to hear, in this sense at least, not much of a hustler. He wasn't doing things the right way.
Well, yeah, right. He wasn't doing things the right way, but at the same time, it's not like he had inauspicious beginnings or anything either. So it's a mixed bag a little bit, right?
That's the leg up he has on the two of us.
Yeah.
Though he wasn't a great hustler, he won the birth lottery and was basically born into the Rockefeller family or something. One of these rare earth metals millionaires doing iron and steel and whatnot.
Mm.
So they had everything they could ever want, but then the problems that come along with that. Apparently overbearing father that's like, you're going to go into business. And he's got all these fucking kids that are like, I'm going to be an artist. Screw you, Dad. And then they get sad, and a couple of his siblings killed themselves. Ludwig was the youngest of 8, I guess. And then he was like, no, I'm not interested in business, but I'm not necessarily good at art. I'm going to go be a philosopher. But he even didn't know that right away. He was maybe going to go into aeronautics or something.
Yeah, it was like engineering. It was very physicsy, I think.
Yeah, from physicsy, but then he, having this general orientation to drill down all the time, went kind of through physics to math, through math to logic, through logic to whatever the hell he ended up doing.
Right.
Reaching the bedrock where his spade is turned, as they say. So I guess his early life was just kind of odd, and he ended up doing all kinds of weird things. The story that I really like is when he moved to Norway and built himself a cabin on some rocky outcrop overlooking the fjords so he could sit down and think.
Yeah.
Sounded kind of interesting guy.
Yeah, he's definitely a wanderer. I mean, and not just in the actual like geographic sense, but a wanderer in many senses, right? So obviously he did the whole drill down thing from aeronautics to his own little bedrock. And, but he also, didn't he enlist in World War I? Or am I wrong about
As I understand it, yeah, he chose to do that.
Yeah, so it's like, okay. So this person is just kind of all over the map in terms of, they're just difficult to figure out. And maybe it is just a result of being the youngest of 8 in a wealthy family, kind of just trying a lot of things out, but maybe just sort of the core who this person is definitely a philosopher. It's at least what he is remembered for, the work anyway. So much so that they publish, posthumously, if I said that correctly, a number of his notebooks, which is hilarious. I don't even know, what was the state of his notebooks? Were they a mess? Or was he like one of those people who just always put the dates and and so people could keep track and put it all together later? Or
Episode 14, when we did Nietzsche's Will to Power notebooks, I think were much more scattered and over a longer period of years, etc. These were, I think, more clear and laid out, and he even had handed certain segments of it off to some of his intellectual brethren at the time.
Okay.
I think this stuff was all written around 1949 to 51 when he was staying with Norman Malcolm, another philosopher with whom he was acquainted. And I guess this Malcolm guy is part of what got him interested in these particular articles from Moore, who, of course, he knew as one of his professors and then thesis advisors. The little tidbit about Moore that I wanted to make sure to put on here is the one thing that I've heard so far that endears this old dogmatist to me is that he apparently, I'm told, didn't care much for the PhD as an institution, as a process, as a thing. So when Wittgenstein submitted the Tractatus to him and Russell, his commentary on it was something like, "This is a work of genius, and otherwise satisfies the requirements of a PhD." And I was like, that's kind of funny. These clever old Brits.
Yeah, that's funny.
I don't know, was he even British? But whatever. So yeah, I think these were just written at that point and kind of handed to people, and they were kind of first draft style.
Mm-hmm. Right.
He knew what he was working on. So the big famous thing about Wittgenstein that everybody's going to mention whenever they talk about him is that he was special and unique in the canon, at least. The people who've made it into the story of philosophy in the West is that he is the one who invented, almost inspired, heavily influenced two different schools of thought. That the latter contradicted the former to a large extent. And that's something that not very many people have pulled off. So in the early days, when he's deciding, I'm going to figure out the foundations of logic and go, dig as deep as one can, and I'm going to go follow Russell around like a little terrier until he listens to me, and I'm going to work on the problems he's working on because he's the smartest man in the world, and I'm going to learn and follow and solve what he can't solve. And then when he's doing this Tractatus, it's all laid out in these very precise propositions and numbered and sub-numbered, and 3.4.2. Whatever. And it's supposed to all be building up one long, large, explicit argument that arrives in the end at the famous "whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must remain silent," basically figuring out what the limits of language are. But that's that project lasted his entire life and covers both phases. This obsession with language, what is it, how is it possible, how does it work, where does meaning come from, all of these sorts of problems. And so the Tractatus style basically evolved into this logical atomism, logical positivism stuff about, everything that's meaningful that can be said can be broken down into these basic constituents, which are names, and meaning comes from reference or denotation, and propositions are grammatical arrangements of these atomistic names for things, and the relationship between language and world is one of picturing. But whatever Wittgensteinian picturing is quite contentious and hard to figure out, despite his attempt at being very clear about things. But by the second phase, that we mostly know through the notebooks published under the title Philosophical Investigations, he has abandoned and even is quite harsh and ridiculing of his earlier attempts to solve these problems, and is saying that, no, it's not about reference, it's about use. And the way that language gets meaning is simply through the forms of life, through the way that linguistic communities employ noises. And that it's kind of this vague, rule-following, family resemblance, game analogy system. And he thinks that the project that he spent 7 years on, writing this Tractatus, is all a big mistake.
Okay, so, and the Tractatus, well, first of all, when you said like a little puppy following Russell, you meant Bertrand Russell, right? The famous philosopher from Oxford?
Cambridge.
And then Tractatus, it influenced logical positivism?
Yep.
Okay, and that was a Popper thing, right?
I think Popper was tangentially related, but it was the Vienna Circle. Morris Schlick, I think, is maybe one of the more central names. Popper hung out with them some of the time.
Okay, but he was so he was kind of in and out, but not all the way in. And then he comes up with this more, I almost want to say, from having not really read much of it, it sounds almost sort of like a more like sociological, anthropological kind of approach to language. Would that be correct, or does that need to be fixed?
I don't know if he looked at it that way or would say it that way, but when you say it, that seems fine to me. That it was much more emphasizing. I mean, I think that's kind of anthropological to look at use. What are these apes doing, and how do their behaviors correlate with their noises?
Yeah, because I mean, it just seems like the other one goes in this drill down to find the essence, or the roots or whatever, and then there's this more almost Kuhnian relativism, sort of let things hang together, and it's just a matter of, almost you could say, like mimetics or whatever. Like there's a sort of there's the exchange of information, and maybe in some contexts there's an aesthetic, pleasure out of using some words over others, or phrases, etc. And then you get this sort of use and disuse of things, and it's almost Darwinian in a way too. But so that is more loosey goosey compared to something that would be more rigorous or what have you in its sort of logical, mathematical kind of approach.
I think that would be a fair characterization, to call the latter Wittgenstein loosier goosier than the young.
Well, that's, tender victuals, tender tidbits. They're loosey goosey. That's the title of this one, by the way.
My strongest connotation memory with that phrase is that one of my elementary physical education teachers would always use that word when people were, trying to participate in sports, but they're just weak little kids with soft bones or whatever, and he wanted them to, harden up, tighten up. Don't quit being so loosey-goosey out there, Grant.
Screwing around too much.
Quit screwing around.
I'm sorry, but the letter is like the suicide note. It's like, P.S. Quit screwing around.
The reason we're talking about this,
yes,
though we're supposed to be talking about uncertainty, is that my spin on what Wittgenstein is doing in the uncertainty is heavily motivated by and invested in his philosophy of language. Part 2 from this Philosophical Investigations latter Wittgenstein style. So we'll get to that when we get there. But before we get there, we have to go through 2 other papers. I'm throwing it all at you tonight. Because uncertainty is quite directly in response to and based on thoughts stimulated by 2 papers, as I mentioned, from one of his teachers, G.E. Moore, entitled A Defense of Common Sense and Proof of an External World.
Oh, yeah.
So, and those,
we're in it now.
Of course, both activate my chimp, because, as people may know if they've listened to episodes 4, 6, 8, 10, like any one that I'm kind of leading. I'm very much a skeptic and a kind of nihilist type, and I am not a big fan of things like external worlds or common sense. But I am a fan of Wittgenstein, so then I'm like, all right, well, why is he interested in this? Maybe I can find a way to see what he's seeing in here that is interesting. And I think that I succeeded in doing that, and then figuring out what Wittgenstein's problem is and why he's not joining us skeptics, at least on the surface.
Wittgenstein or Moore?
Wittgenstein. Moore is the lost cause. Like, there's no, I mean, he's so far away from me.
But you're saying Wittgenstein wasn't joining you skeptics.
Right.
Is that correct?
I think it is.
Nice. All right. Okay.
So, Moore. Philosophers at a certain time, I don't know if it's so much popular right now, but they were often very concerned, perhaps unduly, with attempting to refute what they consider to be crazy ideas or ideas that they don't like. A lot of people have attempted to refute Bishop Berkeley and idealism, or Pyrrho and Sextus and the Skeptics. Those are these radical epistemologies, and I guess in Berkeley's case, metaphysicses, stimulants for a bunch of ink spilling. And that's what Moore was up to in Proof of an External World. He starts out by quoting Kant, who wrote,
"It still remains a scandal to philosophy that the existence of things outside of us must be accepted merely on faith, and that if anyone thinks good to doubt their existence, we are unable to counter his doubts by any satisfactory proof."
Kant had his own version of attempting to provide that proof. Moore was not satisfied with Kant's version, and Moore wanted to provide his own. He wants to prove that there are existing things outside of us. And that's what Proof of an External World is about. Moore is asking what sort of proof, if any, can be given of the existence of things outside of us. The first more than half the paper is all just working out what the hell that is supposed to mean, things outside of us. He reformulates it into defining a thing as whatever can be met with in space, and wants us to understand it in that very wide sense. Subsequently, people haven't spent much time working on that aspect of it. I think that we think it's relatively clear what we mean by external objects. So people mostly concentrate on his quote-unquote proof, his argument that is supposed to show that, and it's pretty famous. You might have even heard of it as a scientist.
Oh boy. I can't wait.
Moore thinks, if I can prove that there exists now both a shoe and a sock, I shall have proved there are things outside of us.
It's an interesting example to use, but go ahead.
Yeah, he doesn't go any further with that. That's a throwaway. But so here's his example.
"It seems to me that there is only one possible proof of the existence of things outside of us, which is a perfectly rigorous proof. I can prove now, for instance, that two human hands exist. How? By holding up my two hands and saying, as I make a certain..."
Oh, you lost the audience already, Moore. They're laughing you off the stage. How? How can I prove this?
"By holding up my two hands and saying, as I make a certain gesture with the right hand, 'Here is one hand,' and adding, as I make a certain gesture with the left, 'And here is another.' And if by doing this I have proved ipso facto the existence of external things, you will all see that I can do it now in a number of other ways. There's no need to multiply examples. It is perhaps impossible to give a better or more rigorous proof of anything whatever."
Okay, is he trying to say that does it, or is he trying to say that's as good as we can do it? Because if it was interpreted that does it, then yeah, there's some problems there, because it's more surprising that somebody in a learned institution or whatever, like Cambridge or, would be willing to go that low. But then it would be a great bit of comedy, of intellectual comedy at least, to be like, yeah, that's it, folks. Like, I can go around just pointing at things, and that's as good as it gets. I don't know. I'm guessing it's the former, not the latter, but I because of the memorableness of this paper, that probably, right?
Right. I have the same incredulity about, wait, what? Are you serious? That's your argument? So just to check, I'm pretty sure it is. I've encountered it in multiple venues. To check on this, I went to one of my favorite reference books entitled Just the Arguments by Michael Bruce and Stephen Barbone, which has, I think they collected about 100 famous arguments from philosophy, and then they're the editors, and they get an expert on more to come in and write about what his argument is. Their version of the argument, the argument published in that book is:
Premise 1.
Here is a hand, here is another.
Premise 2.
If hands exist, then external objects exist.
Conclusion.
External objects exist by modus ponens from P1 and 2. So indeed, that is, apparently, the argument. So you seem to share with me the prima facie difficulty and resistance buying that argument. What is your problem with it?
I guess it just seems to me like he's just totally accepting that his perception is totally accurate or whatever. And in addition to that, he's using the medium of language in order to say that something is external. I think there's a lot of, like internal referencing, right, with language. So it just seems to me like, to be blunt, it seems like something like one of my kids would say, or, something, really simple. But I guess, philosophy is littered with that, right? I think, therefore, I am, there's a lot of this kind of stuff in philosophy, right? Where they just are like, fuck it. I'm just going to say what I actually think. And then that like makes it into the annals of history and philosophy or whatever.
Yeah. And I don't know. Do you think that simplicity is a critique or a refutation? I don't know. It doesn't bother me how apparently simplistic it is. And then you mentioned that he's doing it with language, but I think that he thinks he's doing almost the opposite. He's demonstrating, he's showing. This isn't just about language. He's ostensibly waving the hand, quote unquote, in front of you as he does the language.
Correct. That's true. Well, I guess the other thing then to me seems like he doesn't take the question very seriously. At the time, maybe that was as good as it could get, and that was good enough or whatever. This is something that's maybe reared its head a few times in these discussions. I like simple models, but I'm skeptical that the simple model is, the best way to go, or that if things are complex, then I think it's likely a simple model. It could be an approximation, or it could just be way off, and due to its simplicity, because it doesn't have enough parameters, and it doesn't, we don't know at this point in time anyway, in 2018 or whatever, whether or not what we're even seeing, it's an integrated whole from lots of different areas of the brain. It's just, as far as we could tell, and it just seems, simple's okay, but on such a, I don't know, I almost would want to say, instead of an argument, it's just an assumption.
Here I find sitting over here defending G.E. Moore. That's fun. I would say regarding the point he doesn't take it seriously, well, he wrote a 20-page paper about it, and, he's a BFD. I'm a Cambridge professor, and I'm famous, and I'm a big fucking deal. And I chose to spend my time writing about it, and I go into great detail in paragraph after paragraph about every last word and every, So I think that he's doing his best to take the problem seriously.
Oh, see, I was thinking it was the other way. Would if he was not a big fucking deal, would he have spent the time on that subject then? Would he have tried to do something a little, from my perspective, more serious or what have you? Go into some detail about something and try and work his way up to becoming a big fucking deal, so that once he is a BFG, or D, he then is like, well, I've made it. Now it's my time to tackle the big problems.
I don't know.
And then here's what I come up with.
Enough about him to
2 hands.
To comment on that, I suppose. But, and then your second point was, is it an argument at all or just an assumption? I think this thing I just read, I would count it as an argument I would question premise
Specifically.
1. That, you know, that seems to be assuming a lot, but that doesn't mean it's not an argument to me.
Yeah, I mean, in its structure and everything, you know, it certainly is an argument in that way. But I would just think that the whole point of the external world, I mean, it's just, I mean, who's asking for it other than other philosophers, I suppose, as you mentioned. Everyone else just makes an assumption, including probably scientists.
Especially scientists.
There's an external world, and then I'm just gonna go fuck with it or whatever. Yeah. So then, it seems to me like that. You know, I don't know. I mean, they wrote what was it? The Project Blue book for the UFOs or whatever. That's a huge book. You know, and the whole thing. You know, in the beginning, the guy who was kind of running the show or whatever. This happened to be like Carl Sagan's advisor. I don't remember his name, but he was just totally like, this is fucking bullshit. You know, waste of money. And they wrote a lot of stuff in there, you know? So I don't know. I mean, it seems to me like you can write lots and lots and still not take the subject seriously. So I don't think that's a... Besides, aren't these professors long-winded anyway? Isn't 22 pages short for a philosophical paper?
Let me tell you my biggest problem with it.
Mm-hmm.
I still think we need to have a whole meeting on this, because I think this is a big one and I see it everywhere, but other people don't reference it enough. I don't see how this isn't a big, fat, question-begging fallacy. If the topic under dispute is itself the existence of external objects, and hands are in the category external objects, if that's what is at question, if you make an argument whose premise begins, this object is a hand, boom, like this is a hand, that, to me, begs the question against the whatever the opponent is, the idealist, the mereological nihilist, the skeptic.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of what I thought that I was, you know, you're saying it in your way, and I guess I was saying it in my way when I was like, you know, it's kind of an assumption, though, in a way, like it's already assumed these two external objects are external objects, therefore the external world exists. It's like, and it almost seems like something you just...
So you're kind of saying it's a tautology, or I mean, I guess I could see that as well. Like if the conclusion is external objects exist and premise 1 is here is 2 existent external objects.
Yeah. I mean, it just seems like we are already assuming that the thing is... That's why it seems to me like, just based on the argument, that he just thought it seems almost tongue-in-cheek to me. That's why I laughed heartily when you were like introducing the argument.
We two agree so far that just when we look at this argument, we're like, what the fuck? Can't do that. And a lot of other people have felt that way and written about this over time. So then, with that established, I'm like, yeah, but remember what your job was, Harland. This guy you do respect, Wittgenstein, respects this paper and this person. So you got to keep pushing past this initial what the fuck phase and try to find what the nugget is, if there is one. Try to be charitable. Can we find something here? So
because lovers are gonna hate. No, wait, haters are gonna hate, but are lovers gonna hate? That's the real question here. Well, it's this topic. You're going from G.E. Moore, who you're like, shut the fuck up, and then Wittgenstein's like, that's great, and you're like, what?
Well, yeah, I mean, he doesn't say it's great, but he at least, he thinks it's important and worth thinking about and writing about.
Good deal.
So, all right, when I try to figure out what's going on here, I think that it's that version of the argument that I read with the two premises is just missing a premise. Moore does write about it and talk about it, but it doesn't make it into many formulations of the argument. I think it comes down to looking more closely at a general examination at epistemic concepts in general. We got to, what is certainty, knowledge, rigor, proof, doubt, all these things. And I think a lot is contained in that little clause I read at the end. It is perhaps impossible to give a more rigorous proof of anything, whatever. If we back off from interpreting more as making a dogmatic existential claim when he says, here is a hand, and instead treat him as saying, I am more certain. Whenever people say that, I want to say more confident. I have a thing about the word certain. And now that I mentioned that, I might as well talk about it. I think that we should use the word certain only, exclusively, as a psychological term which indicates a maximal degree of confidence.
Sounds good to me.
More is certain that there's a cat on the mat if he is 100% convinced that there's a cat on the mat. I think that's what certain should mean. It should be an epistemic absolute, and it should apply only to descriptions of epistemic agents. And that what we should use here is the term confidence. So I guess I'm just going to do that. Anyway, so Moore is more confident of the claim, this is a hand, than he is of any premise that is included in a skeptical argument against the existence of hands. So it doesn't have to be 100%. It just has to be greater than the skeptical arguments. And if he is legitimately, reasonably more confident in the hand premise than skeptical premises, then he thinks that that's enough to justify a defense of the external world. He thinks that at some point we just have to reach these quote-unquote bedrock certainties. And for him, this is one of those. So if we stick into that argument, the premise, it is more likely that this is a hand than that any skeptical arguments are sound, then it's, to me, a little bit more reasonable of an argument. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I got caught up on was that, if he's more confident that this is a hand than it isn't a hand, then he's, I would say, likewise, then more confident in an external world rather than that there is an external world, that's proof of an external world. My opinion, just thinking about it when you said it, I was like, well, that means the whole proof thing also gets us in trouble, I feel like, right? I mean, if you're more confident in something rather than, more certain or whatever, then you kind of, I think the word proof has got a poof, and then maybe it has, it's evidence is the word we want to use. Just simply more confident in an external world. That's where I'm at.
Mm-hmm.
Does this help you entirely? Yes, it does. 100% confidence.
100%. Let's get there. I think that Moore does an argument closer to the lines that I'm recommending we switch to in the second paper, in the Defense of Common Sense. So, get ready for a quote.
The method I am going to use for stating, bracket, what I want to state, on bracket, is this. I'm going to begin by enunciating a whole long list of propositions, which may seem at first sight such obvious truisms as not to be worth stating. They are, in fact, a set of propositions, every one of which, in my own opinion, I know with certainty to be true. I begin my list of truisms, every one of which I know with certainty to be true. There exists at present a living human body, which is my body. This body was born at a certain time in the past and has existed continuously ever since, either in contact with or not far from the surface of the earth. Also many other things, having shape and size in 3 dimensions, from which it has been at various distances. Some other things in contact. Large numbers of living human bodies, each of which at some time have been born and continue to exist not far from the earth. Many of these other bodies have also died, and the earth has existed for many years before I was born, etc., etc. I have, I think, no better argument than simply this. namely, that all the propositions just read are in fact true.
He just fucking does it. Like that. It's a very commonsensical defense of common sense. He just says a bunch of things that he finds likely and thinks that the rest of us will also find likely. Then he literally just calls them true. I think that's interesting. It's just so interesting that this is a acceptable way to argue, because to me it's so unacceptable.
Who is this guy, G.E. Moore? What was his mental state? I honestly,
know.
It's just, what did he do before these papers? What's his work like prior to this? Because he doesn't seem to me to be saying anything that anybody who's thoughtful couldn't kind of say as well, but even if they aren't a philosopher or whatever. What is it that he brings to the table with these papers on the external world and common sense that other people in his time couldn't also have just said? What's he doing?
Maybe I don't know, and I don't know more and the reason is because these are the sorts of papers that have made it into my education, and when I read these papers, I decide, I don't need to know this guy. He's an idiot. So I'm ignorant about answers to your questions about who this guy is, what else has he done, why do we care what he's saying. There may be very good reasons, I don't know. Additionally, there's somebody had to say it thing. Like, if these arguments are going to be made, at some point, someone had to codify what other people consider to be the best version of these arguments, and say, it's obvious, but somebody had to say it, somebody had to write it down, and he's the one that happened to bubble up above the surface and get into the anthologies. So he's the one that's doing it.
He was the one with a platform to do it at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, did he also teach at Cambridge or whatever?
Yes, and as I understand it, he was well established. He was platformed before doing these things. I don't know what he did to get his platform, but this is the kind of stuff that if you're doing Philosophy 101 with the freshmen or the whatever, a bunch of them are going to have these attitudes and sympathize with these attitudes and be excited that a wig-wearing old white man, like a special privileged, whatever, like this guy, oh yeah, there's a big famous smart guy who said these things. So I think that's part of it. We just need someone to play this role and to make these arguments that many people are going to want to make as chimps.
Yeah, now I just want to go back and figure out the history here. Anyway, but
too bad we're not doing that.
No, but it's like, did he give interviews? Was there, what I mean, like posthumously, in his, not posthumously, just later in his life, or did, how they do that sometimes? They're like, when you wrote this paper, what were you thinking? Blah, blah, blah. And this was the kind of response you got, how did that make you feel? Or whatever, and I want to go find those writings, and also just kind of want to see what was his trajectory.
Maybe you're right that we should have split this out into 2 meetings, and maybe someday in the future we'll come back and do this as its own meeting.
Yeah.
But to press on with the plan for tonight.
Well, so, apparently, though, Harland, we can just keep going until I fall asleep, so...
We can.
I hope you're going to enjoy editing this tomorrow.
The way that the argument in Defense of Common Sense is written in the Arguments book mentioned moments ago is as follows. And I think this one is slightly more interesting. I have tons of problems with it as well, but...
Premise 1.
The skeptic's assumptions imply that propositions such as, I know that this is a pencil, are false.
Premise 2.
if proposition A is more certain than proposition B, then B cannot falsify A. In other words, if we're more confident of A than B, then we can't use B to throw out A. And that is a huge thing, and that's what Moore is doing in here, I think. I agree.
Premise 3.
I know this is a pencil is more certain than any skeptical premise.
Conclusion.
The skeptic is wrong. The skeptic's assumptions cannot falsify. I know this is a pencil. I think that's an interesting argument form, and there's much that can be said about it that we're not going to say, but that's at least yet. Like, we'll let Wittgenstein come in first.
All right.
But, you know, do you all feel about this one as well? Like, I don't know about this.
Well, not after all the fucking years we've spent chit-chatting, and you're all like, I'm an enemy skeptic. And I'm like, okay, what's that? And then we go in, and I'm like, sounds good to me. What does Tender Vittles have to say?
The first sentence in On Certainty runs as follows.
If you do know that here is one hand, we'll grant you all the rest.
So that's how he's just kicking it right off at the beginning. And I really like that. And I am willing to play by those rules too. Okay, Moore, you've made an argument. It's a valid argument. If your first premise, like if you can convince me to accept that, then I'll follow you down the rabbit hole and we'll have an external world and all this stuff. Okay. But the fact that Wittgenstein says that and has bothered to spend all this precious time thinking and writing about it indicates to me that he does not agree that Moore is allowed to say that he can have that premise here as a hand. That's just kind of his table setter. Now we've got our big question. And I should come up with something to say now.
Oh my God, I was like, was that Hangouts falling away? Or is it you taking an actual pause?
It's taking a pause because now we're like, all right, well, that...
Classic.
All right. So, aside, as though the whole first hour hasn't been an aside. In my experience engaging with other literature, other human beings, talks, etc., Wittgenstein is just like Einstein. Everybody loves him, and everybody wants him to be on their team. So everybody is going to read Wittgenstein, select out certain parts that make him sound like he agrees with them, and they're going to quote it out of context in order to provide evidence that he's buddy-buddy with their position, right? Like people do that with Einstein all the time, and they say things that are ambiguous or easy to misunderstand. The kind of trite example is the way Einstein used the word God at various times and places, and how certain theists nowadays want to pull those out and say, oh, see, even Einstein thought that the God hypothesis was possible.
No, yeah, no. They just recently auctioned off like a letter or something like that he wrote about how preposterous he thought the whole thing was, God and religion. There was, I don't know what the
It's a
amount was,
fake.
but it was a lot. Is it a fake?
Elmire wrote it. No, I don't know. I'm just kidding.
It's like, yeah. I thought maybe like new information had come to light. Yeah, anyway.
So I'm going to do that too. Except since I'm telling you this up front, it makes me more trustworthy.
Oh, you're so noble.
I too think that Wittgenstein, in a sense, is on my team, which I call the Skeptic team.
Oh.
Even though he didn't self-identify that way, didn't write about it. I don't think that he really called himself one, or even like Nietzsche wrote about how, well, the skeptics are great. When you read all these later works that were unpublished notes in various levels of draft, this is one of my favorite things about Wittgenstein and why I like him in the first place, I think. He's a thinker. When you read him, you can just hear and feel what at least convinces me is entirely genuine wrestling with ideas. He really wants to figure things out, get the best arguments, not really take a position, but as best he can, consider everything. But that means that when one is reading it, it's very difficult to tell which remarks are his current position or in his voice versus are any of the other voices in his head that he's kind of going back and forth with. Like, I don't think Wittgenstein has an inner monologue. I think he has an inner parliament and is just going back and forth between all these characters, and he's talking to all of them. Uh-huh. And then they'll talk about the biographers and the people who know him and stuff will describe how he would often lecture, and he's kind of pacing back and forth, and he's looking off into the distance, and you can tell he's in his own head, and he's having these thoughts, and he's talking out loud. And once in a while, he'll kind of hit a snag and get stuck, and he'll just kind of gesture to the classroom like, somebody fucking say something. I'm stuck. Give me something, And then the least timid soul in the crowd may come up with something and say it, and then he'd turn and intensely wait for like, oh, what do you got? And then if he liked it, then he'd get all excited, and he'd be back on, and he'd pace again, and he'd be like, yeah, that's it. And then he can move. But if he didn't like it, he would, dismissively wave his hand and be like, shut up, you fucking moron, or whatever. I don't think he did that, but he was somewhat aggressive and dismissive, and so that many people were apparently a little intimidated and afraid. They didn't know if they should say their thing, like, oh, is W going to like it or not? I don't know. But I also feel like that kind of person at least part of the time, and I like to hear that that's what he was like. One of the phrases that comes up again and again in Uncertainty is the phrase, I should like to say, dash, and then something, and then maybe in the next sentence he'll say, but that fails because of this, or so, and that's how my brain kind of works too, at various times. Like, all right, well, I'm trying to work on this topic. Let me just quiet my quote-unquote conscious mind and let come what may. And like, what is the reaction? But then be able to view that as merely input from some subconscious module and not take it too seriously, but just take it as a hypothesis that we can work with. Episode 17. And then try to come up with some other ones. And Wittgenstein works that way. The point is, since he does that, it's easy for anyone who wants him to be on their team to be able to extract it, because he himself writes as many teams, many players. He's all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
So don't trust me with this interpretation, but just download it and then go read with this in mind and see what you think and see if I'm just crazy and being biased because I want W to be on my team. So my point is going to be something like this. Wittgenstein wasn't himself as a unitary object if we had to characterize the man as one thing. Wittgenstein wasn't a skeptic, but he had a good skeptic module in his head. One of the voices in his head was playing the role of the skeptic, and he was never able to refute that voice. He didn't ultimately become convinced by it, like it, identify with it, and argue for it. But He wrestled with that voice in his head all the time, and he never defeated it. So in that sense, there was a skeptic in Wittgenstein, not that he necessarily was one. So as we go through some of these quotes and some of this stuff from Uncertainty, I'll try to show where I see the inner skeptic in Wittgenstein and how he wasn't able to overcome it necessarily.
Okay. That was very poetic. Go.
I don't want to.
What?
It's a hard job.
You piece of shit. Go. You can be wrong. Talk through it at least, for fuck's sakes. You're like, I prefer silence. But start with like an I should like to say, and then, come on, let's go. Be Wittgenstein or whatever.
So the book is called Uncertainty. So we should probably, to some extent, talk about certainty and what he thought that meant. We're going to contrast it with the word knowledge, because that's probably the most common way people choose to English certainty, with the phrase, I know, ... That's kind of an expression of certainty.
The difference between the concept of knowing and the concept of being certain isn't of any great importance at all, except where I know is meant to mean I can't be wrong. In a law court, for example, I am certain could replace I know at every place in the testimony.
And that makes sense to me. As someone married to a lawyer, I like all these law court examples. I'm always talking to someone who knows about these law courts and stuff. Okay, and this is where we're going to go. We're going to continue referencing back to this meaning is use version of philosophy of language of latter Wittgenstein. He's often going to talk about the way, as a sort of lexicographer or scientist, he's going to be asking us, well, look at how people talk. One of the places that we care about language is in courts of law. In courts of law, any time that someone says, all right, well, I saw O.J. Simpson fleeing the corner of Haight and Ashbury at this date or whatever. I know I did, you know.
Yeah.
If the cross-examiner wanted, they could say, well, I mean, are you certain? And they would just say, yeah, whatever, it's the same thing. I already said I know, I'm certain, it's the same, you know. Yeah, I am certain, I know. That's the way we talk, according to Wittgenstein. Much of the time. But linguistic practice is imprecise. Other times, when we token the phrase I know, it seems to indicate I cannot be wrong. And I think that that's how Wittgenstein thinks that Moore is using it when he says, I know that I have never been a great distance from the surface of the earth. Wittgenstein thinks that Moore thinks he can't be wrong about that. And then he bounces back. Then he lets the skeptic talk, and the skeptic inside Wittgenstein's head is like, well, how do you know that? Maybe you have. You sleep sometimes, right? Well, maybe an alien transported you across the galaxy while you were asleep and returned you to your own bed, and you were not aware of it, but you traveled a long distance from the surface of the earth. Any of these, what Ryan calls arguments from absurdity.
I don't think I'm the only one who calls them that, but yeah, go ahead.
Hey, I'm trying to let you have a meme.
Please. Child, please. Anyway.
So Wittgenstein will often make those moves. He'll be like, yeah, well, all right, you have good reason to believe you've never been far from the surface of the earth, but maybe you have. The skeptics will come up with some occult explanation or possibility, and I can't tell them that they're wrong. Like, well, yeah, maybe you have been. So then we move from there to a problematization of what it means to be wrong. And he's going to try to change the definition of that. All right, so one of the things that he'll talk about is, if I'm wrong about that, then I don't know what the dichotomy, what the analysis of right and wrong even means anymore. If I'm capable of being wrong about all the claims that Moore makes in A Defense of Common Sense, I am a living human body that was born in the past and has existed continuously near the surface of the earth. I interact with other things having a shape and size in 3 dimensions, etc. If the skeptic wants to come in and say, I don't know, I'm not certain about any of that, maybe you're wrong. One of Wittgenstein's attempts to answer the skeptic is to say, well, you're not playing the language game right. Because what is wrong even supposed to mean if I'm wrong about every element of common sense?
Well, that's such a cliffhanger. I thought you make it sound like you're going to continue to talk, and I'm like, I have all these things to say, but then you keep talking. I'm like, all right, fine. And then you're like, then you cliffhang it, and I'm like, Jesus Christ.
Okay, well,
What's the meaning of all this? No, go ahead. You were going to continue.
No, I'm just saying, yeah, if you've got some things kind of building up in the queue that you want to say, I think this is a good time to bring in some of them.
Think back. Well, I don't know. The things first off, just hearing it again, the common sense thing, it's just like, come on. I mean, sure, but why not, if you're going to do this big philosophy paper thing, why not just say, like, I assume these things are correct, and here are the reasons why I assume that. Like, that drives me crazy, but then it's a different time and place and person and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
so
it might be an anachronistic type thing that we are in a venue, in a time and place where it makes a lot of sense to just say, well, fucking stipulate it and work from the stipulation. Why do we have to care about establishing something as a certainty? And if you're right about that, or to the extent you're right about that, that's good news for me as the skeptic or whatever, because I like that. I mean, I'm fine with stipulations, but not knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, just the whole if then else kind of thing seems to be, it allows people to judge things better. Otherwise, you're just faced with these bald-faced premises or whatever they are, This idea of his inner skeptic or whatever it is, I don't know. I find it interesting that that there would be this large enterprise by the name of Ludwig Wittgenstein, and that only part of that enterprise would be a skeptic or whatever. So what was he otherwise then? Like, was he on the hunt for certainty and all that kind of stuff, and that's why, he was willing to entertain these 2 papers in particular?
I can talk about that for a second. This is one of the things that spanned across both periods of, the 2 Wittgensteins from Tractatus and Philosophical Investigations. The end of philosophy, or the bedrock, or the what cannot be said, etc. One of the common memes that you will hear is that Wittgenstein thought that the only legitimate job of philosophers was to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle. That what philosophical problems were, most of them, is merely bewitchment by language. That philosophical problems that people obsess about and write about for 2,000 years are just mistakes. They're linguistic oddities, or they're paradoxes, unresolvable paradoxes, etc. And that what we need to do is dissolve them. We need to we need to just forget about this. Learn how to stop doing that. He's a stop it guy. And this was they talk about the analogy with philosophy as therapy, or, Wittgenstein as a therapist, and just trying to show these philosophers, you guys are just mentally ill, you're sick, you need to be cured of your obsessions with traditional philosophical problems.
Can I just cut in really quick? Hold
Yes.
your thought. The whole stop it thing for the 8.1 or whatever listeners. There's a Bob Newhart comedy sketch he does with Mo
On
Collins.
Mad TV.
On Mad TV with Mo Collins, and she's going in for therapy, and it's very Bob Newhart. And anyway, every time she tells him his problems, he finally is like, "Are you done?" And she's like, "Yep." And he's like, "Okay, are you ready for the therapy to begin or whatever?" She's like, "Sure." And he just goes, "Stop it!" He just yells, "Stop it!" And she's like, and then she starts to elaborate and she starts to talk about other things. And she's like, "Yeah, well, I love him." And he's like, "Stop it!" or whatever. And so it's a funny, you can go to
I love
YouTube
it.
and find,
Yeah.
it's genius. Anyway.
Go see it on YouTube if you're unaware of this skit.
Exactly. So continue on, sir.
So I see Wittgenstein is kind of playing the Bob Newhart to the philosophers, and they come in and they're like, "Yeah, but I don't know if this is really my hand. Like, maybe it's just an illusion, or maybe everything is in the mind and there are no physical objects." Stop it! You gotta just stop it!
Right.
So whatever your question was, set me off on that tangent. That what is Wittgenstein's position if he's not a skeptic? I think was basically the question.
Yeah, more or less, or what's the majority of it?
It's kind of a commonsensical type thing. It's kind of a pragmatic, in a certain angle, pragmatic thing. It's kind of existential in a practical way. It's just, stop it. Like, no. All the skeptical stuff is just linguistic tricks, and we ought ignore it / transcend it. Not refute it, just learn ways to ignore it. Or shunt it aside somehow.
Huh. Interesting. Why?
I don't know. I probably want to get postmodern and psychological about it and do some kind of analysis of, Ludwig, why do you think you want to do that? You're saying there are arguments out there that you cannot refute directly, but you also don't want to buy their conclusions. So what you want to do is try to find an end around in a way that you're allowed to ignore those arguments even though you can't refute them. Why do you think you want to do that?
Well, when was this written in relation to the year he died in 1951?
This was 49 through 51.
So maybe every time he wipes his butt, he's got blood and he's just kind of up against his own personal existential storm. And it has a huge impact on his psychology and the way he thinks about philosophical problems. I don't know, like he said he had prostate cancer. Maybe that's, influencing the way he thinks. Maybe. It's a total speculation.
Yeah.
But just coming from a hypochondriac at times myself, and I'm sure lots of other people in the world, you kind of, it kind of gets, it pulls focus sometimes. And I don't know the kind of individual that this guy was. The only person I sometimes wonder is potentially comparable to these, wonderful individuals that we've talked about so far, a lot of them, Wittgenstein, Nietzsche. And I don't know if this person is wonderful, but I think they kind of fit the bill so far because they're hard to understand and they can't even themselves explain what it is that they're doing. and you're just sort of like, what the fuck? But yet people seem to be very gravitated towards their work, and yet they don't seem to hold positions that would be um, in the mainstream, even though in some ways they are kind of successful. This person, and that would be that Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He seems to have this same kind of thing going on, where everybody's like, half of them disagree, and half of other people who've actually read his stuff think it's great, but they're like, it's genius, but I don't know what the fuck it means. Like it's that kind of like, you know what I mean? Like there's an element there, and it's like, well, what's going on? I mean, is it a language thing? Meaning like, are they, if you read Wittgenstein in German or whatever, or Austrian or whatever language is his native, would it change everything and be like, oh, or you know what I'm saying? Like, or did he write all his notebooks in English and he translated it wrong? I don't know all the details, so.
Yeah, he was writing in German or whatever. The one I'm looking at, was translated by someone named Dennis Paul, who I don't know, and Elizabeth Anscombe, who I do know as someone who was very familiar with and a friend and student of Wittgenstein and highly respected and whatever. But yeah, it was translated.
Right, but still also, you have the old Vienna Circle, right? They were at least Germanic, right?
All right, well, let me just throw out a series of quotes that indicate these are what I mean by that Wittgenstein has a skeptic in his head that he's arguing with.
Cherry picker?
Well, yeah, I'm going to cherry pick, but then and then ICE is going to show up and ask for the papers of the cherry picker and stuff. We'll get there.
Oh, God. Explicit. Go.
So, all right, these are things that as a skeptic I really like. From number 2, from its seeming to me, or to everyone, to be so, it doesn't follow that it is so. Number 4, I know I have a brain. Can I doubt it? Grounds for doubt are lacking. Everything speaks in its favor and nothing against it. Nevertheless, it is imaginable that my skull should turn out empty when it's operated on. You see what I mean? Like that last sentence, that's this... he's got a skeptic in his head. Like, he doesn't like that, but he realizes or admits, like, I can't prove it until somebody cracks my fucking skull open and looks. Maybe I don't have a brain in there. I'm frustrated that voice is in my head telling me that, but it's in there, right? Number 22, it would surely be remarkable if we had to believe the reliable person who says, I can't be wrong, or who says, I'm not wrong. So that version, to me, that's a little bit closer to being the ruling personality. That's not just a voice in his head. That's pretty close to being W himself, but he's still not super comfortable with it. But he's like, whatever, somebody tells me they're not wrong. Why, like, that itself is no reason to believe them. And again, all of these are in light of this Moore stuff that we just read, where he's just like saying shit and saying, this is the truth. And then Wittgenstein's like, well, it would sure be remarkable if I had to believe that. Number 30, one does not infer how things are from one's own certainty. Certainty is, as it were, a tone of voice in which one declares how things are, but one does not infer from tone of voice that one is justified.
Certainty, he's using certainty in the way that we use confidence, I think. Tone of voice.
Oh, yeah, in the way we
voice,
use as confidence. Yeah, as...
That's confidence.
Yeah.
It's an illusion or a delusion, one or the other, or both perhaps, but one or the other. You're either trying to make people think that you're not a fraud or whatever, or you really don't think you're a fraud. You really think you're onto something. And that's the confidence bit, And I think, the more cases you encounter, the more you do the inequalities where you're like, well, case A, I am more confident than B. And so therefore B cannot hurt case A, in this case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Number 13. It is not as though the proposition, "it is so," could be inferred from someone else's utterance, "I know it is so." From his utterance, "I know," does not follow that he knows it. So one thing that I like and is important for the Skeptic, and again, episode 4, 6, etc. I think that Wittgenstein is a correspondence theorist. I think that he is a JTB, justified true belief, is basically what no means. He thinks that if someone says "I know" and is correct to say that, then the object of their sentence is true. He says in number 12, "I know," quote unquote, seems to describe a state of affairs which guarantees what is known, guarantees it as a fact. So if somebody says they know and they're correct about that, then what they're saying is true. So I like that. That's good. I think he's a correspondence guy. Even if the most trustworthy of men assures me that he knows things are thus and so, this by itself cannot satisfy me that he does know, only that he believes he knows. That is why More's assurance that he knows does not interest us. The proposition, however, which More retails as examples of such known truths are indeed interesting, not because anyone knows their truth or believes he knows them, but because they have a similar role in our system of empirical judgments. That was 137, for all of you who are following along. In 403 he writes, "To say of man, in More's sense, that he knows something, that what he says is therefore unconditionally the truth, seems wrong to me. It is truth only inasmuch as it is an unmoving foundation of his language game. I want to say," there it is, "it's not on some points men know the truth with perfect certainty. No, perfect certainty is only a matter of their attitude." 407. For when More says, "I know that's ... I want to reply, you don't know anything. And yet I would not say to anyone who is speaking without philosophical intention, that is, I feel, parenthetical, rightly, that these two mean to say something different. If someone says he knows such and such, and this is part of his philosophy, then his philosophy is false if he has slipped up in that statement, being, I know such and such." So that was, I'm throwing too much out at once. God damn this medium.
Well, but hold on. I mean, it essentially is that certainty and knowing it's like the hope is that there's access to truth and the mutable world or whatever. But that really, it's just a lot of confidence. You're just very confident. Here's the thing. How we've produced knowing and certainty and whatnot doesn't seem to reflect how we behave. It seems to be more wishful thinking than actual or whatever behavior. Because the way we behave confidently, right? And we have what little bits we have that support that expression of confidence. But what those other things in the dictionary definitions of them would mean, we don't have access to. I think you can boil it down better to the confidence thing than you can boil it down to the things in of themselves or whatever that they are trying to align themselves with. That's kind of how I see it. I see it as people want to hide behind the tree and stand perfectly straight and say, see, I've identified the tree. I've identified it so well that I can hide behind it, versus just standing straight in the park amongst some trees potentially, which I think is what it is more going on, is that I'm so confident that if I stand straight, you won't be able to tell me apart from the trees that are super straight as well. Whereas that's somehow also supposed to be communicated as, I am but a tree. I could stand behind one. I could be one. It doesn't, like, I have access to all of that stuff. Going with that, Harland.
I get triggered by your example about trees, and I don't know if you read some of this or not, but that's another one of the everyday examples that's used often in uncertainty and or some of the more articles that, I know that that's a tree. Well, do you? Maybe it's maybe you're pointing at something young and it's actually a bush or something else, and you're mistaken about it being a tree, etc. But so, all right, what is the point of what you're saying? You stand very still and straight in a park and you assert that I am a tree. And are you saying other people might not be able to tell the difference because they're looking at the characteristic of uprightness, and both you and the tree exemplify it? What are you talking about?
What I'm trying to say is that the confidence is the measure or whatever, or the expression of your belief or whatever in something. And when people say they know something, it seems to me that what they want you to think is that they are able to identify the things themselves or whatever, that they have the tools upon which to be able to do that. And what it to me ends up looking like, and this is, I guess, a terrible analogy or whatever, is just them confidently standing straight in a little grove of trees, thinking that they fooled you into thinking that they are but also a tree because they know it so well. It's this confidence thing that they exude in their behavior. And so I guess it's a terrible example. And yeah, tiredness and beer are involved. You could edit all of this out. But that's kind of where I was coming from. It seems to me like there is, nothing that they actually possess other than a nod to the definitions or the abstractions of what we mean these things to be, knowing, certainty, whatever, versus what it is that we actually do, which is the behavior of expressing confidence.
Yeah, I think I just agree with that then, right?
Yes, and so
yeah.
It's the expression of it that to me is what it comes down to. Like, that's the sign that you're dealing with something that's confidence, because all you get is the expression of what people are saying. You don't get beyond that. That's why I think it's kind of an assumption. Yeah, I assume, based on all the things that we've put together about what a tree is, and all the categories that we have for them, all the studies, the biological studies, all these things, the things you get when you're growing up as a kid and you climb that tree and all that kind of stuff. That is just, we assume that there is something there for, we interact with it or whatever. And we all point to it, and we all have this, gathering of information and, communication amongst each other about it. But in the end, really, it just comes down to, if you were, push comes to shove or whatever, it just comes down to, it's boiled down to confidence.
And in what contexts do we want to critique people's expressed, evinced confidence and say, well, you shouldn't be that confident about that, or not? That's at least where I go. I don't know about you. If you ever want to do that, make that move.
Well, I mean, I would say that's fine to be confident in something, because confidence goes as far as all the things that are fed into it. It could be your, fucking limbic system, but it could also be the network of interactions and discussions that you have. It could be go back to when you're a little toddler and your parents point and say tree. It could be all these kinds of things, but then it could also be you become a botanist and you study trees and forests and stuff, and you're worried about climate change or whatever, and you just keep going and you learn about how, there's vascular plants and non-vascular plants and just all these kind of different variations that we use to try and talk about what we're looking at. And somebody says, hey, I see the pattern as this, and somebody goes, yeah, I think I can see that, and then just keeps going and going, and textbooks are written and whole departments are created, and uh we use it to create pulp and write on with and make paper, and there's so much going on, and so uh the confidence is all fed in from that, from our activities, our behavior, and all that kind of stuff. I feel like somehow I have managed to be the more skeptical one, and it's just bizarre. But the issue here is that I think the whole issue here is that you just assume it and then you're good. And that's sort of, to me, maybe I can take the whole stop it thing and work it in that way. Just be like, stop it, just assume it is what it is and just keep going, play with it, work with it. That's all we've been doing anyway up to this point. So come on, instead, you philosophers are like, no, it's not good enough. And it's like, Jesus, fuck. At least, I guess somebody's got to say it's not good enough. But I don't know if that's what Wittgenstein's meaning by when we say stop it from the Bob Newhart skit, but that's what I mean. Stop it. Just assume you have a left hand, fucking G.E. Moore. Instead of worrying about thinking that it's an actual premise.
One way that Wittgenstein literally writes stop it is in section 31 of On Certainty. The propositions which one comes back to again and again as if bewitched, these I should like to expunge from the philosophical language. Do you hear that? That's the way he says, stop it! Episode 3, right? We talked about the game players and the truth seekers. And I think that's what I'm hearing you keep going back to in your version of assumption. I think you see assumption as a game player activity. And you're like, well, why can't we all just be game players? Be satisfied to say, okay, let's assume here is one hand and here's another. What do we do now? What follows?
Right.
That's the game player attitude to the claim, here is one hand. I don't think that's Moore's attitude. I read Moore as a truth seeker. He's defending common sense. He's not just playing the game. What if we were commonsensical philosophers? I think he wants to move from these premises to certain, in the sense of 100% confident, propositions and move, and see where that goes. So that, in part, is why we developed that language game of talking about characterizing philosophers, scientists, inquirers, thinkers as either, or somewhere along this continuum of game players to truth seekers.
So where does Wittgenstein fall in this triumphant joy?
I'm gonna think. To briefly review, because probably anyone who listens to this won't have heard the other one. Who knows? We have this either triangle or diamond, depending on how you look at it, that you can plot on a Cartesian coordinate system or something. That one of the axes is game players on the left and overseers on the right. Overseers are kind of the paradigm case of your arch philosopher position type thing. They are telling people, they're comparing different games. They're saying, well, if you play by those rules, here's what would happen. They're conditional and they are normative, and they'll talk about what they think you should do if given this and that, well, you should do this, blah, blah, blah. And then the other axis.
Historians.
Oh,
To an extent, historians, I think, are also sort of overseers to an extent. They don't blow the whistle as much, but they're sort of in that camp. Anyway, go.
And the other
On the other
axis is
side.
between truth seekers and engineers. Are you interested in making something that works, or are you interested in discovering the ultimate and eternal truth? And that if you plot that thing out as a diamond, you can take any individual, including yourself, and try to put a dot somewhere in there. Well, maybe I lean toward overseeing and engineering, or maybe I lean toward truth-seeking and whatever. So you can go anywhere in there. So Ryan's question is, where do I think Wittgenstein is in the diamond? Right? And that's a difficult question. I haven't thought about it before. I'm guessing that he's more a game player than an overseer and more an engineer than a truth seeker.
Huh.
Or, but I don't know. I shouldn't even say because I want to take it all back as soon as I say he's hard to place.
Is he slap dab in the middle?
Perhaps. You should have asked me to prepare that if you want an answer to that question. That's too hard for me right now.
Oh, well, do you think that one's too hard? Where's Nietzsche falling?
Wrong episode.
I should be asking this every episode.
That could be a refrain we attempt to employ. Keep referring people back to that episode, see if we can get someone to listen to it.
Yeah.
Let's look again for a minute at this number 407. The text of which is,
When Moore says, I know X, I want to say, you don't know anything. But yet I would not say that to anyone who is speaking without philosophical intention. These two mean something different.
I think that Wittgenstein is highly contextual, and that he's using this language games concept to say, well, it depends on what you mean by I know. And I know is used in an odd, particular way as a term of art by, quote-unquote, philosophers. So when I'm reading Moore, I'm well aware that when he says I know, he's using it in a very philosophical sense, and he's making these absolute claims. And he's doing metaphysics, and he's got all these... So that against the philosophers, Wittgenstein leans skeptical and says, I want to reply, you don't know anything. And that's, of course, dear to me. I'm like, yeah, that's what you should say. But Wittgenstein doesn't want to say that to the common man or the witness in the court case, or what he doesn't want to bring. He thinks that would be inappropriate to say in court. If the person says, well, I know what I saw, that's the bank robber, he's right there. That it wouldn't be a very successful court system if we allowed the opposing counsel to say, well, do you really know it? Well, I don't know if anyone knows anything. I'm a skeptic. Like, he's like, no. You're playing the wrong language game.
What's a language game?
Language game is a concept, a term from philosophical investigations. It's very near the beginning, and his primary example of it is a world that has two human beings and a bunch of engineered objects. And what they are doing is architecting a structure, some shelter or something. The objects are pillars and slabs. And then you've got an architect and an apprentice. And the architect is giving orders to the apprentice, such as, bring me a slab. Or, how many slabs remain? As I'm trying to work out my... Or, I need 2 slabs, then a pillar, whatever. So that you have this situation where there's a contextual dynamic, that there's a praxis, that's the form of life part. There's the what are we doing? We're making a building, and I'm the boss, and you're the gopher. And then we've got the noises that we make to coordinate our activities. So he's purposely making it kind of trivial because he wants it to just be a game. The language game is the noises that these two individuals exchange in order to coordinate their behavior when hauling, schlepping shit around and making a structure. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Does he really think it's just like a game in the sense that people are just, playing ping pong? Is that how he thinks? It's just a focus? And okay, I hit the ball, you hit the ball, back and forth? Or is he, do you think he means game as in like, the more social level games that people play, which is, you know what I mean? Like it's more, there's more nuance, there's more implicitness, there's more, you know what I'm saying? Like, what does he mean then by game? Because games is, could be a very explicit thing, and games can also be this sort of strange, implicit kind of activity.
Let me say two things about that, and then you can re-ask the question if it remains after these two things. I'm not sure if they directly address it. Two of the reasons that he uses the term game in this case. Number one, that there's a sort of rule-following aspect. That in order for these two individuals to successfully coordinate their noises and behaviors, they have to, in some sense and to some extent, play by the same rules. If one person wants a relatively flat object and makes the noise slab now, but the other one interprets that noise to mean cylindrical long object and brings a pillar, then it won't work, whatever. So that there's, in order for this game to be played, they have to play by the same rules. So that's part of it. And then another part is another of the Wittgenstein tropes that everybody who talks about him will always bring up. The family resemblance point. So, this is one thing that changed drastically between Wittgenstein 1 and 2, between Tractatus and Investigations. In the olden days, Wittgenstein thought that it was kind of one-to-one. You have a name, you have an object in the world, and you have the denotation relation. Name denotes object. Consider how that is possible with the category word game. Wittgenstein says, good luck coming up with an Aristotelian necessary and sufficient conditions style definition of game that corresponds entirely with the Korzybskian extensional definition of game. Like, you can't make an Aristotelian definition of game that covers all of the things that human beings happen to call games. Why not? Because there isn't one. We use the word game in a way that different things that we call games don't have an essence. They just have a vague sort of resemblance, kind of like members of a family. Well, they got big noses and their eyes are far apart and dark hair and whatever, but some of them don't. That it's much more vague. I think those are two of the reasons that he calls things language games. There is no delineated set of necessary and sufficient conditions that you can use to call something a language, or determine where one language starts and where one ends, or because they're always changing, evolving, altering, overlapping. Anyway, those are 2 points. Do either of those or them together answer your question, or is there leftovers?
I mean, there's stuff I would say. Do you want to continue
Say it.
on with that, or okay? On the one hand, it makes me think of a couple things. It makes me think of I think David is his first name, but David P. Carse in that finite and infinite games thing.
James?
Book. James, thank you. James P. Carse and Finite and Infinite Games. I don't know why I said David.
They're both biblical.
And yeah. And it's a kind of thing where language games would be kind of like infinite games. But any other kind of games where you're playing cards or you're playing football or whatever would be more like the finite thing. And so the only thing that seems like it's tweaked is they all have rules, but that in finite games there's a winner or a loser, and in infinite games there isn't. So language games, it keeps going. And so the second thing I wanted to insert there was this idea that, one of the things that I think you like a lot is the idea of just sort of setting out some kind of protocol or whatever, a hypothesis, a statement, and then testing that. And then if it doesn't fly, then you can make an adjustment and work from there and continue on or whatever. Whereas the language games thing seems like it's kind of provisional. Like you could say, hand me that slab, and somebody could say, in a joking way, something else. I don't know what it would be. But maybe the person who said, hand me that slab, they like that. And then they keep kind of, it is, whatever it is that we're pointing to and calling the thing or whatever, it starts to evolve, the name, the nomenclature or whatever. So it seems quite provisional. But that there's like this family resemblance thing that, I don't know. I'm not quite there yet. Like, I don't see the significance of that. I could see where you do have more or less necessary, sufficient, whatever shit kind of definitions, where essentially the criteria, at least, are rules, and then whether or not there's a winner. And that would be games. And those two kind of games could be finite and infinite. And infinite is very much provisional, and it changes. And the point is to continue the play. And, the finite one would be to win.
Both the philosophical language game and the common sense man on the street language game are both infinite, I think.
Yeah, I would say so.
So, yes, that dichotomy can be emphasized, but in the language game sense, we're contrasting different infinite games. Yes, they're both infinite, but they're still distinct in various ways.
Sure.
Wittgenstein writes,
I'm sitting with a philosopher in the garden. He says again and again, I know that that's a tree. Well, pointing to a tree that is near us. Someone else arrives and hears this. And I tell him, this fellow isn't insane. We are only doing philosophy.
and I think that's a great joke.
Oh, I was hoping that you were going to be like, that is not a tree. That's Bob pretending to be a tree. And my whole analogy thing would have come true. Oh, well. I didn't get the joke, but that's okay. It sounds like philosophers only.
Well, I'm just, it maybe doesn't count as a joke. It makes me laugh. Just imagine the situation. You have two individuals seated somewhere, and one of them keeps emphatically insisting, no, look, and he gestures toward it. He's like, no, that's a tree. I know that's a tree. But then, like the UPS driver or something is walking up, and they see one person yelling at the other one, red in the face and spilling their drink. That's a fucking tree, you bastard! Then, the calm person tells the interloper, no, what? Don't worry about him. He's fine. He's not crazy. We're just talking about philosophy. Because in no other context would anyone get red in the face and scream, I know that that's a tree. That takes philosophy in order to make that happen.
Yeah. I stand by what I said earlier.
You son of a bitch.
You're the son of a bitch with your fucking philosophy.
You don't get it.
Jesus Christ.
You don't understand me, Dad.
Oh, God. Tell me totally. You don't understand me, Dad. I'm like, you're wasting your life. Your mom and I are tired of this shit. Anyway.
Just to put this on the recording, because my initial claim was like that Wittgenstein has the skeptic in his head and he can't deal with it, but he wants to deal with it. Check out number 470. He says, why is there no doubt that I am called LW? It does not seem at all like something that one could establish at once beyond doubt. One would not think that it is one of the indubitable truths. So, and this is another refrain that comes up often in the work as a skeptical example. He's like, if I know anything, I know my own fucking name, skeptics. But then, the skeptic inside his head is like, well, why don't you doubt that? Maybe you're not Wittgenstein, you don't know. And anyway, the passage directly following that is, in brackets, here there is still a big gap in my thinking, and I doubt whether it will be filled now. And I may be misreading the whole thing, but to my interpretation, that just indicates this tension inside the guy between the skeptical voice in his head and the ruling personality, or whatever we're supposed to call it, that doesn't want to be a skeptic. He'll say, I know what my name is. Fuck you. And then the skeptical voice will be like, yeah, well, I don't know. Why don't you doubt that? I think you should doubt that. Why aren't you doubting it? And the ruling personality is like, fuck, I don't know. There's a big gap right here. I know I don't like it. I don't know why. Urgh. And he never resolved that until the end.
Wait, he never resolved that period? It was, or he resolved it in the end. I don't know which.
I mean, I don't know. I, again, am not a scholar. Maybe somewhere else in some other Wittgensteinian text, one could argue that he does resolve it.
Okay, so he
as far as I know, he never resolved that tension between the skeptic in his head and what he wanted to be.
When you said until the end, I was like, okay, are we at the end?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah. Weren't playing the same language game.
He writes,
When one hears more say, I know,
in italics,
that that's a tree, one suddenly understands those who thinks that has by no means been settled.
So when Wittgenstein reads more, he suddenly becomes sympathetic with the skeptics. Because he's like, here we have this guy who for some reason is writing a big long paper and teaching at Cambridge and saying things like, I know that I'm a human being who was born. And that's just a weird, I think he's kind of like you, right? Like you're like, what the fuck why do you write that down? What are you doing?
Yeah, basically.
And Wittgenstein's like, when I hear more do that, all of a sudden I become sympathetic to the skeptics who are like, that is not at all settled. Because he's saying that's not part of our language game. That's not something that should be done. Because how...
Well, I'm confused about the name thing. Like, I know I'm Ludwig Wittgenstein or whatever. There's no other Ludwig Wittgensteins. Like, come on. Even Albert Brooks changed his name from Albert Einstein to Albert Brooks. Like, come on now. There's lots of people. There are other people named Ryan McKenna. Probably other people named Harlan Grant. Or other things. Like, why isn't that entering into the fray? Like, I know I am this name. Like, well,
What
this other person's also that name,
the
maybe.
phrase
You
was,
know?
"Why is there no doubt that I am called Ludwig Wittgenstein?" So it's not that there's some kind of, essential, like, I am this or whatever. It's just that that is how I am called. That's the noise other people make when they want to talk about me, whatever. Does that deal with what you're saying or not?
Yeah, I mean that's a good, that's
That's
obviously
better.
it's better.
So my interpretation of his best answer to this skeptical voice in Uncertainty is a running theme about, and this is a Morean move, that Wittgenstein is saying, as he does in number 2, right at the beginning,
From it seeming to me or to everyone to be so, it doesn't follow that it is so. What we can ask is whether it can make sense to doubt it.
his attempted response to the skeptic is to attempt to undermine their doubts through this common language attitude, I think. He's saying,
Okay,
that's not how the word doubt is used by most people most of the time in daily life, and that's how words get meaning. So when a skeptic comes in and says, I doubt that that's your hand, Wittgenstein is saying, you're talking nonsense now.
why is it that somehow his own stuff doesn't come into play? Like, why doesn't the language games thing that come into play? Like, I doubt that's your hand because over here we call it a foot. I know, I am called Ludwig Wittgenstein, but this guy, some people call Ryan McKenna, is calling you Tender Vittles. I, I'm trying to say, like, there's various contexts upon which why doesn't his own philosophy about language fall into that particular thing where in a different context that isn't the case, and then there you have uh your way out, and well, in this scenario you aren't called Ludwig Wittgenstein or something like that. So you could say then, I know I'm called Ludwig Wittgenstein in this context, maybe. And then you'd have to say, well, how do you know you're called in that context? Well, how do you know you're in that context? Or something like that. That seems to me like the way, why doesn't that find its way into his thinking? I mean, maybe because you would say it's stupid or something. I don't know. But that's what comes to my mind.
One thing that he writes is, a doubt about existence only works in a language game. So to talk about the skeptic and what they're claiming, his attempt to undermine them is similar to, like, More's version was, I'm more certain of commonsensical claims than I am of any skeptical claims. Wittgenstein's version is, skeptical claims cannot be meaningfully formulated because in order for words and sentences to have a meaning, they have to be employed that way in common usage, and common people are not skeptics. That's not how the word doubt works. Skeptics are merely in this, they are bewitched by language, and he wants to expunge that. Your question seemed to be kind of a meta one, right? I don't know if this is what you're saying. Wittgenstein, your point is, meaning is use. Well, what if we apply your own theory to itself? If you're saying meaning is use, well, all right, well, let's go look at how human beings use the word meaning. And when they do that, do they mean use? No. Isn't that a problem for you? Is that what you're saying?
I don't think that's what I was saying. What I was trying to say, successfully or unsuccessfully, was if he knows he's called Ludwig Wittgenstein, the additional information is in some particular language game, right? In some particular context, he's called Ludwig Wittgenstein. He might be called something else in a different context. And so he could say, okay, well, I know I'm called Ludwig Wittgenstein in whatever this context, whatever the context is, whatever that language game is. And from there, he could say, a skeptic could say, but do you know you are in that game right now? How do you know? And then he would have to have a reply like, well, because of something or other, maybe. And then I just think that that's what I was thinking when you were saying he thought that was the way out of the skeptic dilemma. I just thought, well, isn't it always in some context? He's already presented some ideas about what's going on. Why can't that be literally applied to his dilemma?
Let's see if this has any relevance.
You have these long pauses, and then you need to like come up with a quote. What do you think? No quotes.
Okay, no quotes. What's a direct question? Shortly, briefly. What is it?
No, I mean, just what do you think about that? Like, why isn't he applying that? Like, do you think that's a possibility for him when he says, I know I'm called Ludwig Wittgenstein and I never answered that question or I never found a way out? I'm saying, why isn't the way out his own ideas about language games and the context that they provide, and that in some context he's called Ludwig Wittgenstein? Does he know he's in that context? That would be the skeptic saying, how do you know you're in that context? To be called Ludwig Wittgenstein, how do you know? You're in... Are you getting this or no?
I am not.
What's going on?
I don't get what the question is. I agree with you that is one thing that a skeptic could retort. Like, if you are confident, if you are certain that you are called Ludwig Wittgenstein, when you are called that, you are called it inside of a language game. Okay, so now you've raised your confidence because, oh, yeah, all right. But then the skeptic comes back with, well, how do you know what language game you're in? Maybe you would be called that were you in language game X, but how do you know you're in that language game?
Right. And
so I don't know what the question is, though, then.
Given that, what do you think of it? And what do you think of that in the context of him not being able to answer it? Like, why didn't he use that himself? I mean, it's not answerable, I suppose, but I'm just presenting it to you. You made it sound like it was this big, like, oh no, and that no one has any good answers for that. And so I was just, when you said that, it triggered all these cascades. And I was like, well, why not? He's got this whole thing where you could have these various language games. And in one, he's called Ludwig Wittgenstein, but how does he know he's in that?
If the question is directed...
I don't understand the significance of that last part then, if my thing is not happening. You know what I mean? Like
I'm saying if the question is directed at me,
so what?
And you're saying, don't give me a Wittgenstein quote, but Harland answer it. I don't have an answer. I like that as a skeptical retort. I think that's a good place for the skeptic to go, and I'm not sure that it can be well answered. Because my opinion would be, no one ever has a right to claim to know what language game they're playing. They might have pragmatic reasons to suspect they are playing a certain language game, but one never knows, and maybe you thought you were playing a language game and you were mistaken. And that sounds like what a bunch of Jonathan Swift books are about, right? Like, I don't know, like I thought I knew where I was, but I didn't, and all of a sudden weird shit started happening to me, and I don't know the rules anymore, and now I'm tied down by a bunch of midgets, and whoops, I don't know, I thought I knew, but I don't. To me, that seems always possible. Assume, though, that Wittgenstein would be able to do better than me and attempt to answer it. One thing that seems relevant is, and we'll check, because I'm going to quote now, because I tried to do what you wanted me to do.
All testing, all confirmation and disconfirmation of a hypothesis takes place already within a system. This system is not a more or less arbitrary and doubtful point of departure for all our arguments. No, it belongs to the essence of what we call argument. The system is not so much the point of departure as the element in which arguments have their life.
Do you think that's a sort of Wittgensteinian response? If the hypothesis is, I am in language game X, the language game where I am called Ludwig Wittgenstein, if we want to question that, if the skeptic comes in and says, but are you really? Maybe you're in language game Y. Now we've got these conflicting hypotheses. And Wittgenstein says, testing of hypothesis, you're already inside of a system. So I think he's just, again, trying to deny the skeptic their move. They want to question, well, what system are you even in? And he's like, well, you can't ask that sort of question because all of those questions and all arguments about what the right answer is has to be systemically embedded in the first place. And then this is a part that I would be putting on top of it. I think he privileges the everyday common sense system, and then he'd just be saying, but all of us are always already in the system of our birth and development. We're in Germany 1949, or we're in America 2018. And so that has to be the ground that we use.
I don't know about that last part. That didn't trigger anything for me. But the whole point of the skeptic is, to me, playing the part of the null hypothesis that we talked about last time. And so, if you remember, it is kind of like Boolean logic or whatever, A, not A. So, the question the skeptic is posing, in my thinking, is not to say, haha, you will never, ever, ever. It is to say, well, get more specific. Come up with a way to, test whether or not, you are being called, Ludwig Wittgenstein, rather than just saying that and saying, well, I guess I sympathize with G.E. Moore. And of course, I haven't read these texts, but from everything that it sounds like, I'm just saying, well, get a little bit more specific. So then it's like, okay, are using his own ideas against that? It seems to me it's saying, okay, well, maybe in this context or this language game, you were called Ludwig Wittgenstein. How do you know you're in it? It isn't to say you will never be me, Ludwig. It is just to say, I want more from this statement. You sympathizing with G.E. Moore have not done it for me. You need to do more than more. And that is, all the skeptics seem to provide is just, to me, a null. It is not what you thought it was.
I wonder if his response to that framing would include what has come to be called his Hinge Epistemology, and I don't have the quote up right now for the way he precisely phrases the hinge thing, but the concept is, you got your door and then you got your hinges, and in order for the door to open and close, it has to have something fixed, the hinge, upon which the door itself turns. So Wittgenstein goes back again and again to that sort of concept. All right, skeptic, you can try to ask me these difficult questions about how do I even know what game I'm in or whatever. But Wittgenstein is trying to cut the ground out from underneath those people by saying, you can't even ask that question. In order to ask it, you have to be asking it in a language, and any language that you speak is not based on, doesn't support a skeptical semantics. And so you can't do it at all. He writes,
If you tried to doubt everything, you would not get so far as doubting anything, The game of doubting itself presupposes certainty.
And I highlight that one and find it fascinating. I don't know exactly what he means by that. I think I disagree with it. I think it comes from the hinge concept. Like, all right, if you're going to doubt, like that's part of the door, but in order to even formulate a doubt, you have to do it in some language that already presupposes certainty. He doesn't make explicit arguments. He often makes analogies, such as this one. If a blind man were to ask me, "Have you got two hands?" I should not make sure by looking. If I were to have any doubt of it, then I don't know why I should trust my eyes. For why shouldn't I test my eyes by looking to whether I can verify that I have two hands? What is to be tested by what? Who decides what stands fast? Who decides what the hinge is? And I don't know. That's one of those things that makes me want to pace around and think for a while. Moore says, here's one hand, here's another. The skeptic tries to undermine that somehow, tries to doubt it. Oh yeah, are those really two hands? And then Wittgenstein's response to the skeptic is, all right, if you ask me to verify that I have two hands, how the fuck do I even prove that? Well, one thing I could do is look at them or show them to you, as Moore tries to do. But if we're playing the skeptical game, then why do we believe even that? Why do we believe the eyes? Now we've got to be skeptical about that and test whether your eyes work. Well, how do you test whether eyes work? You look at things that you know are there, such as hands. And so that Wittgenstein's picture is a sort of, I think, attempt at a reductio ad absurdum of skepticism by saying, look, guys, we've got to have something in order to operate at all. We all do operate in the world. We do stuff. Like, just look, this is common sense. Everybody walks around acting as though they have two hands. So what does it even mean for you to come in and say, I don't believe that. I doubt whether you have hands. You're talking nonsense and you need to stop it. I don't know if any of this makes sense. I think you're probably just getting more and more frustrated.
Well, I think the only little bit of potential clarity that I've gained is that I think that's just the difference between, somebody who has a, formal and personal education in philosophy and somebody who's got a, the same kind of thing, but in more of the sciences or whatever. I guess there's a bunch of people in philosophy running around just fucking unquenchable in their skepticism that they just want to keep going and going and going. And I suppose that's who Wittgenstein is addressing. But I guess to me, I was just taking the more scientific route. And I kind of feel like it's overkill, all of this other stuff, but I guess that's the metaphysics,
I think,
right?
Yeah, what's happening with this topic, and maybe a lot of the things that I try to talk about, you don't get it because you're already outside of it, and you're already in a position that I'm fine with. And you're just like, wait, people actually don't think this way? And you're just like confused. It's like that quote I read earlier about that had something to do with, as soon as I hear more intone the phrase, I know that that's a tree, all of a sudden I have sympathy with the skeptics. I think you're kind of like that position, right? You're thinking, well, I already didn't claim that was a tree, and I didn't know that anyone really gave a shit. But if this guy is going to walk in and start making a big deal about it, I guess if I had to pick a side, I would pick the skeptic side. But it would be better to not even engage in this discourse in the first place. Let's just say, well, I assume that's a tree, and if it's a tree, I can get shade under it, or what, I can do some kind of scientific investigation. How old is it? Well, I'll cut it down and count the rings. Blah. I don't even think about whether or not it, quote unquote, is a tree, or that I know it's a tree. You don't care.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, at the very least, you just break it down into smaller pieces so that you can manage it a little bit easier, rather than have this ongoing, long-running internal dialogue with your internal parliament. And just try and, see if there's a way to even just answer the skeptical question about it. And that's what I thought a lot of these people like R.A. Fisher and, Pearson and all these statisticians were attempting to do for science, was give them some techniques that allowed them to take these kinds of philosophical conundrums in bite-sized pieces. And then, we've kind of moved on a little bit from that to an extent. But in any case, it is still a methodology upon which you can say, all right, well, it is or it isn't, and you have to then at least be charged with the task of saying what the hell is going to be in your framework or whatever. And then if it isn't, then it just isn't, and you move on from there and you try and maybe improve or whatever. Yeah, that's that's all I was thinking. So that when you made the statement that I know I'm, that Ludwig, or you quoted Ludwig Wittgenstein as saying, I know I'm called Ludwig Wittgenstein, I think the skeptic would be like, okay, well, given this framework you've provided about language games, etc., let's apply that to your own words, and then we can start to ask questions like, well, are you? Like, in what context? In what language game? And then from there, you can start to maybe do tests or whatever. But instead, like, philosophers want to play a completely different game than scientists do, apparently. And I'm like, Jesus Christ. And you're like, well, Ludwig would say this. And I'm like, I don't care anymore. Let's do the test.
But isn't that a common theme between at least the two of us? And to the extent that we stand in as sick scarecrows for quote unquote philosophy and science, a difference between philosophy and science, that the scientists don't think about or care about many of the problems that philosophers appear to care about. For example, you guys don't think, other than the sciences who actively study language, you don't think about language very much. And philosophers, at least in 2018, think about it a lot.
The past, 1 and nearly a quarter or more years, centuries, I mean. Yeah. Language seems to be a very important thing to philosophers. So much so that you guys think that it's almost the only thing.
Well, they shouldn't.
And that may be well, they seem to be very enamored with it. And
no,
it's kind
all right.
of gross.
Here's the bumper sticker. Language
it's gross.
is
Weird
the sine qua non of intellectual activity. Without which not. If not language, then no science, no philosophy, no skyscrapers, no cell phones, no nothing.
You don't think chimpanzees or something couldn't still build stuff?
Not very interesting or sophisticated.
A science? All right, well, at least you'd be willing to admit that. Yeah, I mean, language is clearly huge. I'm not saying it isn't. But I guess, what it comes down to is it's like, it's the philosopher's theory of everything or something. It's like language. That's the theory of everything. And I don't know, I guess the skeptical individual in me is like, oh, is it? You know, and then we're back at square one again, which is a fine place to be, in my opinion. I think it's healthy. But then I want to ask, okay, you know, let's test this, but I don't know how to test it because I'm tired. But still, that's kind of like, yeah, when you say those kinds of things, I'm like, my cackles.
Cackles.
Something's...
Well, you cackle too sometimes. What do you want to say? What do you want to put on the cassette before we eject it?
Excellent. Well, you know, there are, yeah, I don't know. There are many individuals in philosophy. Let's admit it. They're primarily white men. Some
yeah,
gay,
Wittgenstein
some
was
straight.
gay, right? I don't know. Anyways, I think he was.
Guessing. He was gay, right? Or he believed in gay rights? Yeah, I mean, but these individuals, they are, you know, I think, from all the discussions we've had and some of the readings that I have done, you know, very impressive individuals. But there's always in philosophy, at least these philosophical individuals, it's never, and it seems like it never will be, seems like it never is, a closed loop. Like these people, it's Wittgenstein, Nietzsche, you know, they just seem to me, maybe as well, someone like Hume, they seem to just continue the conversation, and it just sort of is like a Pandora's box of philosophy. And yeah, Wittgenstein to me, just he's an exemplar of that. Like people just keep talking. Here we are, 2018 podcast. He doesn't even know what the fuck that would be. This crazy technology. We're talking about him. You know, like it's just amazing to me. That's one of the things I wanted to say. Nietzsche, you know, all these other people that we've
Your
talked about.
deference procedure is inappropriate.
Oh, jeez. Well, Moleskew. What do you want to say?
Here's
That's
a
correct.
hand. This is a hand. If I know nothing else, it's that. This is a hand.
Give me a hand.
Take a little walk to the edge of town and go across the track where the viaduct looms like a bird of doom as it ships and cracks, where secrets lie in the border fires and the humming wires. Yeah, man, you know you're never coming back. Across the square, across the bridge, past the mills, past the stacks. On a gathering storm comes a tall, handsome man in a dusty black coat with a red right hand. He'll wrap you in his arms, tell you that you've been a good boy. He'll rekindle all the dreams that took you a lifetime to destroy. He'll reach deep into the hole, heal your shrinking soul, but there won't be a single thing that you can do. He's a god, he's a man, he's a ghost, he's a guru. They're whispering his name through this disappearing land.